Disabled veteran asks Trump about healthcare at a rally. What happens next? Stuns everyone. The kitchen clock read 4:17 a.m. when Mike Davis knocked over his coffee mug, sending cold coffee spreading across the stack of medical bills. He cursed under his breath, grabbing paper towels with shaking hands. "Daddy?" Mike turned to see Tommy standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. The 8-year-old's Batman pajamas were too short at the ankles. He was growing so fast. "Hey buddy, what are you doing up? I heard noise. Are you okay?" Mike forced a smile, trying to hide the grimace as another wave of phantom pain shot through his missing leg. "Just clumsy. Go back to bed, champ." Tommy didn't move. Instead, he walked over and started helping clean up the spill, just like his dad had taught him. His small hands were careful with the wet bills. "These are from the hospital again, aren't they?" Mike's throat tightened. When did his son get so observant? "Don't worry about that stuff. It's grown-up business." "Is that why you're going to see the president today?" Before Mike could answer, Jenny appeared in the doorway. She was still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her night shift at the VA hospital. The irony wasn't lost on Mike. "Tommy, baby, let's get you back to bed," she said softly. But her eyes were fixed on her husband. She'd been against this plan from the start. Once Tommy was tucked in, Jenny came back to the kitchen. She didn't say anything at first, just started making fresh coffee. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "The signs are all there," she finally said, measuring coffee grounds. "You're having a bad pain day. You shouldn't go." Mike rubbed his thigh where flesh met prosthetic. "I have to." "No, you don't. There are other ways." "Like what, Jen?" His voice came out sharper than intended. "More appeals? More paperwork? More waiting on hold while some bureaucrat tells me my pain isn't service-related?" He gestured at the pile of bills. "We're drowning here." Jenny slammed the coffee pot down. "You think I don't know that? I see it every day at work. Vets just like you, fighting for basic care. But rushing into a political rally with your PTSD." She wiped her eyes. "What if you have an episode?" "I won't." "You can't promise that." "Last week at Tommy's game." "Don't." Mike closed his eyes, trying to block out the memory. The pain had been unbearable that day. He tried to push through it, wanting to see Tommy pitch. Then, everything went black. He came to with his son crying and a crowd gathering. The shame of that moment still burned. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma. Outside, the first hints of dawn were appearing. In a few hours, the rally would start. "Remember what Dr. Martinez said about crowds?" Jenny tried again. "The noise, the chaos." "I remember everything she said. I also remember her telling me my treatment options, right before our insurance denied them." Mike wheeled his chair closer to Jenny, taking her hand. "Look at me, honey. I've thought this through. I've got my coping strategies. I'll take my anxiety meds, but I have to try. For Tommy." Jenny squeezed his hand. "At least let me come with you. You've been up all night at work. You need rest." "Mike Davis, if you think I'm letting you do this alone." A floorboard creaked, and they both turned to see Tommy standing in the doorway again. "I want to come too," he said firmly. Mike and Jenny exchanged looks. "Buddy?" Mike started. "It's going to be a long, boring day." "I don't care. You always say Davis men stick together." Mike felt his resolve wavering. "What about school?" "It's Saturday, Dad." Jenny let out a small laugh despite herself. "He's got you there." The sun was fully up now, painting the kitchen in soft morning light. Mike looked at his family, his wife still in her scrubs, his son in his too short pajamas, both of them ready to stand by him. His throat tightened. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll all go. But first, Tommy, you need breakfast. And real clothes. Can I wear my Marines t-shirt? The one that matches yours?" Mike nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As Tommy ran off to change, Jenny wrapped her arms around Mike from behind. "I'm still worried," she whispered. "I know. Promise me something. If it gets too much, the crowd, the noise, anything, we leave. No heroics." "I promise." The drive to the rally site took almost 2 hours. Tommy kept the mood light from the back seat, chattering about his baseball team and his upcoming science project. Mike tried to focus on his son's voice instead of the growing anxiety in his chest. They arrived to find the parking lot already packed. Mike could see the line stretching around the building. Hundreds of people, many wearing red caps and waving flags. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, checking for his anxiety meds. "Look, Dad." Tommy pointed at a group of veterans near the entrance, some in wheelchairs, others with prosthetics like Mike's. "They're like you." Mike nodded, throat tight. They were like him. Proud men and women who'd given pieces of themselves for their country, now waiting in line for a chance to be heard. Getting through security was a challenge. The metal detector kept beeping because of Mike's prosthetic. The guard, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I'll need to do a pat-down." "He's a Marine," Tommy announced proudly. "He got hurt protecting us." The guard's face softened. He called over his supervisor, and they expedited the process. Mike caught Jenny's eye. Their son's unwavering support kept opening doors. Inside, the stadium was a sea of humanity. The noise hit Mike like a physical force. Chants, music, conversations, all blending into an overwhelming roar. He felt his heart rate spike and reached for Jenny's hand. "We can still leave," she whispered. Mike shook his head. They'd come too far. He focused on his breathing, just like Dr. Martinez had taught him. In through the nose, out through the mouth. They found spots about halfway back from the stage. Standing was hard with his prosthetic, but sitting on the provided chairs was worse. They were flimsy plastic things that made him feel vulnerable. He chose to stand. The hours crawled by. Tommy stayed close, holding his dad's hand whenever the crowd surged or the noise peaked. Jenny kept scanning Mike's face for signs of distress. But Mike's mind was focused on one thing, the note card in his pocket. He'd written and rewritten his question dozens of times. Each version felt inadequate to capture the reality of his situation. How do you sum up years of pain, frustration, and bureaucratic battles in one question? As the rally progressed, Mike watched other veterans in the crowd. Some wore their combat decorations. Others, like him, carried their service in less visible ways, in limps and scars, in haunted eyes and nervous glances at loud noises. Each time the crowd cheered, he saw several of them flinch. "Dad," Tommy tugged at his sleeve, "when are you going to ask your question?" "Soon, buddy. They said there'd be a Q&A portion." "What if they don't pick you?" It was Jenny who answered. "Then we'll find another way. There's always another way." But Mike knew this might be his only chance. The pain in his leg was getting worse. Standing for hours was taking its toll. He shifted his weight, trying to find relief that wouldn't come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Q&A portion began. Aides with microphones started moving through the crowd. Mike raised his hand, trying to catch their attention. Tommy, seeing his father struggle, raised both his hands and jumped up and down. "Pick my dad," he called out. "Please, pick my dad." People around them started noticing. A few veterans nearby joined in, waving to the aides. One man in a wheelchair spoke into his oxygen mask. "Let the Marines speak." The momentum built. More people joined in. An aide looked their way, then spoke into his headset. Mike's heart pounded. This was it. This was his chance. The microphone was coming toward him. He could feel Jenny's hand squeezing his arm, could hear Tommy's excited whisper, "You can do it, Daddy." Mike reached for the note card in his pocket, but his hands were shaking too badly to read it. It didn't matter. He knew what he needed to say. He'd lived it every day for the past 3 years. The aide reached their section. The microphone was being passed down the row. 3 people away. 2. 1. Mike took a deep breath. The weight of thousands of eyes fell upon him. The stadium lights were blinding, but he could feel Tommy's small hand in his. Jenny's strength beside him. He raised the microphone to his lips. "Mr. President," he began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I need your help." The crowd's constant murmur died down. Mike could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Tommy's grip on his hand tightened. "My name is Michael Davis. I served 3 tours with the Marines." He paused, swallowing hard. "This leg?" He gestured down at his prosthetic. "Lost it to an IED in Afghanistan. But that's not why I'm here today." Mike felt Jenny's hand on his back, steadying him. The stadium lights were hot, making sweat trickle down his neck. He could see his face on the giant screens above the stage. He looked older than his 34 years, pain etched in lines around his eyes. I'm here because. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and started again. I'm here because last week, I had to look my 8-year-old son in the eye and tell him I couldn't play catch. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't afford my pain medication. Tommy pressed closer to his side. Mike wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. The VA keeps denying my claims. They say my chronic pain isn't service-related. A bitter laugh escaped him. Try telling that to my body at 3 a.m. when I'm crawling to the bathroom because my leg, the one that's not even there anymore, feels like it's on fire. The silence in the stadium was absolute now. Mike could see veterans in the crowd nodding, some wiping their eyes. Last week, at my son's baseball game. He had to stop, the memory threatening to overwhelm him. Jenny's hand pressed harder against his back. Breathe. Just breathe. Last week, I collapsed at my son's baseball game. Passed out cold from the pain. Woke up to him crying, scared his daddy was dying. Mike's voice broke completely. My wife works night shifts at the VA hospital. The irony of that kills me. She takes care of other vets because we can't afford my own care. He looked directly at Trump now, his voice finding strength in desperation. Sir, I don't want pity. I didn't serve my country for pity. But I've got a stack of medical bills on my kitchen table that's taller than my son's baseball trophy. I've got a little boy who's afraid to hug me too hard because he doesn't know when the pain's going to hit. And I've got a wife who hasn't had a full night's sleep in months because she's working overtime trying to keep us afloat. Mike felt Tommy trembling against him. He wanted to stop, to protect his son from this raw display of vulnerability, but he couldn't. Not now. So, my question is simple, Mr. President. Mike's voice grew stronger, fueled by 3 years of pain and frustration. What's your specific plan to fix the broken veterans' healthcare system? Not promises, not slogans. What's your actual plan to help veterans like me? Because, sir, with all due respect, we can't wait anymore. Our families can't wait anymore. The microphone shook in his hand. The silence stretched out, heavy with anticipation. Mike could feel the weight of the moment, the thousands of eyes on him, the cameras broadcasting his face across the nation. But most of all, he felt his son's arms around his waist, his wife's hand on his back, and the phantom pain in a leg that wasn't there anymore. In that moment, standing before the most powerful man in the country, Mike Davis wasn't a political statement or a photo opportunity. He was just a father who wanted to play catch with his son again. The stadium held its breath, waiting for an answer. For 3 heartbeats, the stadium remained frozen. Mike Davis stood there, microphone trembling in his hand, his son Tommy pressed against his side. The silence was deafening. Then Trump did something no one expected. He set down his prepared remarks. "Hold the cameras right there," he commanded, waving off an aide who tried to hand him back the papers. "Stay on this Marine." Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably as Trump moved to the edge of the stage. The usual bombast was gone from his voice when he spoke again. "Stand up, Marine." Mike was already standing, leaning heavily on his cane. Jenny steadied him as he straightened his back out of pure instinct, muscle memory, from years of following orders. "Everyone, look at this man," Trump continued, his tone different from his usual rally voice. "Really, look at him, not at the cameras, not at your phones. Look at this, Marine, and his family." The spotlight swung fully onto Mike, harsh and bright. He squinted against it, feeling exposed. Tommy's grip on his waist tightened. "Sir," an aide approached Trump, speaking in a hushed tone. "We need to stick to the schedule." "The schedule can wait." Trump cut him off, loud enough for the microphone to catch it. The crowd murmured in surprise. This wasn't the scripted rally they were used to. "Sergeant Davis." Trump addressed Mike directly. "How long did you serve?" 3 tours, sir, 2016 to 2019. "And where were you when?" Trump gestured to Mike's leg. "Kandahar province. Our convoy hit an IED. 2 of my men didn't make it home." A veteran in the crowd called out, "Semper Fi." Others joined in, the cry spreading through the stadium. Trump held up his hand for quiet. "You mentioned the VA. Tell me exactly what's happening with your care. Not the short version. I want to hear everything." Mike glanced at Jenny, who nodded encouragingly. He took a deep breath. "It started with a phantom pain, sir. Doctors said it was normal after amputation, but this was different. Some days it's like my missing leg is being crushed in a vice. The first VA doctor prescribed basic pain meds, but they barely touched it. And then? Trump prompted. Then the real battle began. Every time I needed stronger medication, there was more paperwork, more evaluations, more delays. They kept saying they needed to verify the pain was service-connected. Mike's bitter laugh echoed through the speakers. As if losing a leg in combat wasn't connection enough. A woman in the crowd shouted, "This is shameful." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the stadium. "Sir," Mike continued, his voice growing stronger, "I've got all the documents. Every form, every denial, every appeal. I keep them in a binder next to my Purple Heart. Sometimes I wonder which one cost more, the metal or the paper they keep using to deny my claims." Tommy looked up at his father. "Show him your leg, Dad. Show him what happens." Jenny started to protest, but Mike was already rolling up his pant leg. The prosthetic was visible now, along with the scarred tissue above it. "The socket doesn't fit right anymore," Mike explained. "BA says I'm not eligible for a new one for another 8 months. Meanwhile, it rubs my skin raw. I wrap it in gauze, but—" He pulled back the gauze slightly, revealing angry red abrasions. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Several people turned away. But Trump didn't flinch. "Keep going," he said. "I want to hear all of it." For the next 7 minutes, an eternity in rally time, Mike detailed his struggles. He talked about the endless phone calls, the hours spent in VA waiting rooms, the appeals that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. He described how Jenny had to pick up extra shifts at the hospital, the bitter irony of her treating other veterans while her own husband suffered. "Last month," Mike's voice cracked. "Last month I had to make a choice. My pain meds or Tommy's new baseball glove." He'd been saving his allowance, but it wasn't enough. "Dad," Tommy interrupted, his voice small but clear in the microphone. "I told you I didn't need a new glove." The crowd was completely still now. Some veterans in the audience were nodding, tears streaming down their faces. They knew. They lived it too. An older man in a Vietnam veteran's cap stood up. "My story's the same," he called out. "Been fighting the VA for 40 years. Another voice. 3 years waiting for a PTSD evaluation. Had to sell my car to pay for surgery." The stories started pouring out. Veterans all over the stadium finding their voices. Trump stood silent, listening as the carefully choreographed rally transformed into something raw and real. Campaign advisors were frantically whispering into their phones. This wasn't the planned message. This wasn't the script. The media crews were going wild, cameras swinging between Mike and Trump, capturing every moment. "Mr. President," a campaign manager approached the stage. "We need to move on. We're way behind schedule." Trump waved him off again. "Schedule's canceled. I want to hear more." He focused back on Mike. "You said something about collapsing at your son's baseball game. Tell me about that day." Mike swayed slightly. Jenny quickly grabbed a chair from nearby, helping him sit. The pain from standing so long was becoming unbearable. "It was Tommy's first time pitching," Mike began, his voice heavy with shame. "I'd skip my meds for a few days to make them last longer. Thought I could handle it. Wanted to see my boy pitch." Tommy picked up the story, his voice trembling. "Dad was cheering for me. Then he just fell. His eyes rolled back and everything. Mom was working, so I didn't know what to do. I thought." The boy choked up. "I thought he was dying." A woman in the crowd sobbed audibly. Others were wiping their eyes. The stadium's atmosphere had transformed from a political rally into something like a church service. Silent, reverent, heavy with shared pain. Trump stepped even closer to the stage's edge, so close that Secret Service agents moved forward nervously. "Look at me, Marine," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silence. "Really, look at me." Mike raised his eyes, meeting Trump's gaze. For a moment, all the political theater fell away. It was just two men, one broken, one powerful, looking at each other across a divide that suddenly seemed bridgeable. "Stand up again if you can," Trump said softly. Jenny helped Mike to his feet, supporting him as he swayed. Tommy pressed against his other side, trying to help bear his father's weight. "Everyone," Trump's voice rose, addressing the crowd but keeping his eyes on Mike. "Look at this family. Really look at them. This is what we're talking about when we say support our troops. not bumper stickers, not flag pins, this right here. He paused, scanning the crowd. How many other veterans here have similar stories? Raise your hands. Hands went up across the stadium. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one representing a story like Mike's, a family struggling, a warrior betrayed by the system meant to protect them. Trump nodded slowly, his face uncharacteristically grave. Then he did something that sent ripples of shock through his staff. He set down his microphone and walked to the stairs at the side of the stage. Secret Service agents rushed to surround him, but he pushed through them, making his way down into the crowd. The entire stadium held its breath as the former President of the United States walked directly toward Mike Davis and his family. The moment hung suspended in time. A moment that would be replayed on news channels for weeks to come. Analyzed by political pundits. Shared millions of times on social media. But for Mike Davis, standing there with his son and wife, none of that mattered. All that mattered was what would happen next. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Trump made his way through. Secret Service agents formed a tight circle around him, their eyes scanning constantly. The stadium had gone so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning humming. "Sir," a campaign manager called from the stage, "we really need to." Trump cut him off with a wave, never breaking his stride. As he got closer, Mike could see something in his eyes he'd never noticed in all the television appearances and rallies, a flash of genuine emotion. Tommy pressed closer to his father, both scared and excited. Jenny's hand tightened on Mike's arm. When Trump reached them, he did something that made his security team visibly nervous. He extended his hand to Mike. "Sergeant Davis," he said, his voice different up close, quieter but somehow more intense. "I want to shake the hand of a Marine who had the courage to tell the truth." Mike shifted his weight, trying to balance on his good leg, as he reached out to shake Trump's hand. The pain made him grimace, and he swayed slightly. Trump noticed. "Get this man a chair," he barked. 3 people rushed forward with chairs. Once Mike was seated, Trump did something else unexpected. He crouched down to be at eye level with Tommy. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy Davis, sir," the boy answered, his voice barely a whisper. "Tommy, how old are you?" "8, sir. Almost 9. Trump nodded seriously. "And you play baseball?" "Yes, sir. I'm a pitcher." Tommy stood a little straighter. "Dad's been teaching me when he can." Trump turned back to Mike. "You know what makes me angry, Sergeant Davis? Really angry?" He didn't wait for an answer. "We spend billions on weapons, on tanks, on planes. But when one of our best comes home broken, we can't find the money to fix him?" The stadium was still dead silent, thousands of people holding their breath, watching this unexpected moment unfold. "Mr. President," Jenny spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "We've tried everything. Every appeal. Every form." "No more forms," Trump cut her off. He straightened up, turning to face the cameras. "No more appeals. No more waiting." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal phone. The crowd stirred. Everyone knew about that phone, the one that could set social media on fire with a single tweet. "Right here, right now," Trump announced, his voice carrying across the stadium without need for a microphone. "We're going to start fixing this. Not with speeches, not with promises, with action." Mike felt his heart pounding. Was this really happening? After 3 years of fighting the system, of being ignored, of drowning in paperwork, was change actually possible? Tommy's small hand found his again. In his son's grip, Mike felt both hope and fear. Hope that things might finally change. Fear of being disappointed yet again. Trump held up his phone, making sure the cameras caught the moment. The entire stadium seemed to lean forward, waiting to see what would happen next. "Jim," Trump said into the phone, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. "I need you to clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. We've got work to do." The voice that answered was clearly surprised. "Mr. President, I'm in a meeting. Cancel it. Cancel everything. I'm standing here with a Marine who's about to change how we do things. And Jim, bring your resignation letter, just in case." The stadium erupted. The stadium was still buzzing with electricity from Trump's phone call when it happened. A commotion erupted near the security entrance, voices rising above the general murmur. "Let me through," a woman's voice rang out. "That's my husband up there." Mike's head snapped up, He knew that voice. Jenny? Through the crowd, they could see security guards trying to block someone's path. A flash of hospital scrubs. The glint of something held high in the air. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one guard started. "I will not step back." Sarah Wheeler burst through the security line, still wearing her VA hospital badge, her face streaked with tears. In her raised hand was a small plastic object that made Mike's heart stop. Tommy's empty inhaler. The crowd gasped as she pushed past the final row of people, emerging into the cleared space where Mike stood with Trump. Secret Service agents moved forward, but Trump held up his hand again. "Let her speak," he commanded. Sarah's scrubs were wrinkled, her hair escaping from its hasty ponytail. She'd clearly come straight from her shift at the hospital. Her hands were shaking as she held up the inhaler. "You want to know what this broken system really looks like?" Her voice cracked with emotion. "This is my son's empty inhaler. He needs a refill, but we can't afford both this and my husband's pain medication this month." The stadium fell silent again. Even Trump seemed taken aback by her raw desperation. "I just finished a 12-hour shift," Sarah continued, her voice rising. "You know what I did today? I helped a veteran with the exact same injury as Mike get the exact same medication we can't afford. Why? Because his paperwork got approved and ours didn't. That's all it came down to. Paperwork." Tommy moved closer to his father, frightened by his mother's intensity. Mike tried to reach for her, but she wasn't finished. "Tell them about last week, Mike," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Tell them what really happened at Tommy's game." "Jenny." Mike's voice was warning, pleading. "No, they need to hear this." Sarah turned to Trump. "My husband didn't just pass out from pain, Mr. President. He had been rationing his medication for weeks, taking half doses, skipping days. He knew Tommy's inhaler prescription was coming due, knew we couldn't afford both." A woman in the crowd sobbed. Others were wiping their eyes. "He didn't want Tommy to miss pitching." Sarah's voice broke completely. "Our 8-year-old son had to watch his father collapse because we had to choose between them breathing." The empty inhaler shook in her raised hand. A news photographer's camera clicked rapidly, capturing the moment. "Mrs. Davis," Trump spoke quietly. "How long has this been going on?" 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, she answered without hesitation. "That's how long we've been fighting the VA. I know because I mark every appeal on our calendar. Right next to Tommy's baseball games and Mike's bad pain days." She reached into her scrubs pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "This is Mike's latest denial letter. Want to know their reason? Insufficient evidence of service connection. He lost his leg to an IED. What more evidence do they need?" The paper trembled in her hand. Mike could see the familiar VA letterhead, the same one that had been haunting their kitchen table for years. "Jenny," he tried again. "Maybe this isn't the place." "Then where is the place, Mike?" She turned to him, anguish clear on her face. "The VA office where they keep losing our paperwork. The pharmacy where I have to tell them we can't afford your full prescription? Or maybe Tommy's next baseball game, where I pray you don't collapse again because you're trying to be brave for our son?" Tommy's small voice cut through the tension. "Mom, are you mad at Dad?" Sarah's face crumpled. She dropped to her knees, pulling Tommy into a fierce hug. "No, baby. I'm mad at a system that's forcing your daddy to choose between his medicine and your inhaler. I'm mad that you have to be scared every time he comes to your games." The stadium was absolutely silent now. Even the usual whispers and coughs had ceased. Every eye was fixed on this family's raw display of pain and love. Trump stood very still, watching. His usual showman's demeanor was gone, replaced by something more contemplative. Finally, he spoke. "How much?" Sarah looked up, confused. "Sir?" "The medications, both of them. How much per month?" She laughed bitterly. "With our current coverage, Mike's pain medication would be $847. Tommy's inhaler is $235. That's with all the discounts and assistance programs we could find." Trump turned to the crowd. "Over $1,000 a month. That's what we're asking this family to pay. A Marine who gave his leg for this country has to choose between his pain medication and his son's ability to breathe." He walked closer to where Sarah knelt with Tommy. "Stand up, Mrs. Davis." She rose slowly, still holding Tommy close. Mike wheeled his chair next to them, and for a moment, they stood together as a family before the most powerful man in the country. "I made a phone call earlier," Trump said, his voice carrying across the silent stadium. "But I don't think it's enough. This isn't just about one family. This isn't just about one Marine." He turned to face the cameras directly. "This is about every veteran who's been forgotten, every family that's been broken by a system that was supposed to help them heal." Sarah's hand found Mike's shoulder, gripping it tightly. Hope and skepticism warred on her face. They'd heard promises before. "Sir," she said, her voice steadier now, "we don't want special treatment. We just want the system to work. We want to be able to take care of our family without having to choose who suffers less this month." Trump nodded slowly. "No more choices," he said. Then louder, "No more choices." The crowd began to stir, energy building. "No more forms," Trump's voice rose. "No more denials. No more Marines choosing between their pain and their children's health." The stadium erupted in cheers, but Sarah wasn't finished. She held up the empty inhaler one more time. "With all due respect, Mr. President," her voice cut through the noise, "we've heard promises before. What makes this time different?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of 3 years of broken promises and desperate hopes. The crowd held its breath, waiting for Trump's response. What happened next would be replayed on news channels for weeks to come. Trump took a step closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to a level of intensity rarely seen in his public appearances. "You want to know what makes this time different, Mrs. Davis?" He reached for the empty inhaler in her hand. "This makes it different. Your son's empty inhaler. Your husband's pain. This family's story." He held up the inhaler for the cameras to see. "No more props, no more campaign promises. This ends today." He turned to his staff. "Get me the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, not tomorrow. Now." An aide rushed forward with a phone. "Sir, he's in a budget meeting." "I don't care if he's meeting with God himself. Get him on the phone." The stadium was so quiet you could hear the phone ringing on speaker. 3 rings. 4. Then, "Mr. President?" "Bob, where are you right now?" "Sir, I'm in a budget planning session for next quarter." "Perfect." Trump's voice took on an edge that made his staff exchange nervous glances. "I want you to stop whatever you're doing and listen carefully. I'm standing here with Marine Sergeant Mike Davis and his family. I'm holding his son's empty inhaler in my hand. Want to explain to me why this Marine has to choose between walking and letting his son breathe?" Silence on the line. "Bob, I asked you a question." "Sir, I'd need to review his case file." "Review this?" Sarah burst out, her voice shaking. "My husband's case number is 47,829B. I know it by heart because I've written it on every appeal for 3 years. Look it up. Right now." There was the sound of typing on the other end of the line. Yes, I see the file." The secretary's voice came back. "There were some issues with the documentation of service connection. He lost his leg to an IED." Sarah's voice rose. "How much more service connection do you need?" Tommy pressed closer to his father, frightened by his mother's outburst. Mike wrapped an arm around his son while reaching for his wife's hand with the other. "Bob," Trump's voice was dangerously quiet now, "I want you to listen very carefully. This Marine's appeal? It's approved. Right now. This second." "Sir, there are procedures." "The procedures are what got us here," Trump's voice boomed through the stadium. "I want his full benefits reinstated. I want his son's inhaler covered. And then I want you to pull every denied veteran's claim from the past 2 years. Every single one. And I want them on my desk in 30 days. Mr. President, that's thousands of cases." "Then you better get started." Trump's eyes locked with Mike's. "Because I promise you, Bob, if this family doesn't have their medications by tomorrow morning, you'll be looking for a new job. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir. Crystal clear." "Good. Expect my call in the morning." Trump ended the call and turned back to the Davis family. "Mrs. Davis, take your son to the pharmacy first thing tomorrow. If they give you any trouble, you call the number my staff is going to give you." Sarah stood there, stunned. The empty inhaler slipped from her fingers. Mike caught it, his hands shaking. "Mr. President," he started, his voice thick with emotion. "Number," Trump cut him off. Don't thank me. This isn't a favor. This is what should have happened 3 years ago. He turned to address the crowd. This is what should happen for every veteran who serves this country. No more waiting. No more denials. No more choosing between a father's pain and a child's breath. The stadium erupted in cheers. Veterans throughout the crowd were standing, many in tears. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stepped forward one last time. "Sir," her voice cut through the noise. "Thank you. But what about the others? All the other families going through this right now?" Trump's face set in determination. "That's why I want every case reviewed, every single one. And Mrs. Davis, I want you to help." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Me? You work at the VA. You see this every day. I want you on the review committee. You know what to look for, what these families are going through. Will you do it?" Sarah looked at Mike, then at Tommy, then back at Trump. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll do it. For every family like ours." The crowd's cheers grew deafening. Reporters were shouting questions. Cameras were flashing. But in that moment, Mike Davis wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about tomorrow morning, when his son would be able to breathe easily again. When his pain might finally be manageable. When his wife wouldn't have to work double shifts just to keep them afloat. He was thinking about all the other veterans out there, watching this moment, perhaps daring to hope that their turn would come too. And for the first time in 3 years, that hope didn't feel like a betrayal. Dawn was just breaking when Mike Davis's phone rang. He fumbled for it, careful not to wake Tommy, who had finally fallen asleep, curled against his side on the couch. They'd been too wired to sleep in their beds after the rally. "Hello?" he answered quietly. "Sergeant Davis." The voice was familiar now. "I trust you're ready to start the day?" Mike sat up straighter, instantly alert. "Yes, Mr. President." "Good. Because Bob's waiting for you at the VA Medical Center? Been there since 5 a.m.? I made sure of it." Trump's voice had the same intensity it had carried at the rally. "Your wife working today?" "She was supposed to, sir, but—" "Good. Tell her to go in, but not as a nurse, as part of our review team." There was a pause. "And Sergeant, take your son to get his inhaler first. I want to know the minute he has it in his hands." Mike looked down at Tommy's sleeping face. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. We're just getting started." The line went dead. Mike sat there for a moment, letting reality sink in. Then he gently shook his son awake. "Tommy, buddy, time to get up. We've got somewhere to be." Tommy stirred, blinking sleepily. "Is it real, Dad? What happened yesterday?" "We're about to find out." Sarah emerged from the kitchen, already in her scrubs. She'd been up all night, too wired to sleep, cleaning the house obsessively like she always did when stressed. "Was that?" she asked, gesturing at the phone. Mike nodded. "He wants us at the VA center. And he wants Tommy to get his inhaler first." The pharmacy opened at 7 a.m. They were there at 6:45, joining a small crowd that had already gathered. News must have spread about what happened at the rally. Several people recognized them. "You're the family from the rally," an elderly veteran said, leaning on his cane. "My daughter showed me the video, made me cry, and I haven't cried since NAM." Others shared their stories while they waited. A widow fighting for her late husband's benefits. A young veteran with PTSD struggling to get mental health coverage. Each story different, yet painfully familiar. At exactly 7 a.m., the pharmacy doors opened. The pharmacist, a young woman named Rachel, looked startled to see such a crowd. "We're here for Tommy Davis's inhaler prescription," Sarah said, stepping forward. Rachel checked her computer, then frowned. "I'm sorry, but our records show this prescription was denied due to—" Her phone rang. She answered it, listened for a moment, then looked at the Davis family with wide eyes. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." She hung up and immediately started typing. That was the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Your prescription has been approved." "All of them have been approved." Sarah's hands were shaking as she took the inhaler. Tommy looked up at his mom, then his dad. "Can I try it?" Mike nodded, throat tight. Tommy took a deep breath from the inhaler, his first full breath in weeks. The relief on his face made several people in line tear up. Mike's phone buzzed with a text. "Inhaler acquired?" He texted back. "Yes, Mr. President. Tommy just took his first breath from it." The response came immediately. "Good. Now get to the VA. Bob's waiting." The VA Medical Center was buzzing with unusual activity for such an early hour. Staff were rushing around, phones were ringing constantly, and in the middle of it all stood the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, looking like he hadn't slept. "Sergeant Davis," he called out when he saw them. "Mrs. Davis. And you must be Tommy." He knelt down to Tommy's level. "How's that new inhaler working?" "Good, sir," Tommy replied shyly. "I can breathe better now." Bob stood up, addressing Mike and Sarah. "We've been here since 5 a.m., reviewing your case and setting up the review process for others. Your full benefits are reinstated, backdated to your original claim. You'll receive compensation for all out-of-pocket medical expenses from the past 3 years." Mike felt his legs go weak. Sarah grabbed his arm to steady him. "And the other veterans?" she asked. "The ones from the rally?" "We've set up a command center in Conference Room A. We're starting with the cases of veterans who were at the rally, then expanding to all denied claims from the past 2 years." He turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Davis, the President was quite insistent that you be part of this process. We've arranged for your nursing shifts to be covered. You'll be paid your full salary plus overtime for serving on the review committee." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "When do we start?" "Now, follow me." Conference Room A had been transformed into a war room. Dozens of computers had been set up, each staffed by a VA employee. On the wall, a large screen displayed a running tally of cases reviewed and approved. "Each case gets 3 reviews," Bob explained. "One from a medical professional, one from a benefits specialist, and one from a veteran or veteran's family member who's been through the system." "Mrs. Davis, that's where you come in." A young woman approached with a laptop. "Mrs. Davis? I have your first case ready for review." Sarah squeezed Mike's hand, then followed the woman to a workstation. Soon she was immersed in reading, her nurse's training and personal experience giving her unique insight into each case. Mike watched her for a moment, then turned to Bob. "What about my pain management?" "Doctors waiting in room 112. Full evaluation, new prescription, and we'll be fitting you for a new prosthetic this afternoon." Bob checked his phone. "President's been texting me updates every hour. I don't think he slept either." Tommy tugged at Mike's sleeve. "Dad, can I stay and watch Mom help the other veterans?" Mike looked at Bob, who nodded. "We'll set him up with some coloring books in the corner. Might do everyone good to see who we're really fighting for." Over the next few hours, the scene in Conference Room A became both heartbreaking and hopeful. Veterans and their families started arriving, drawn by news of what had happened at the rally. Each brought their own story, their own stack of denied claims. Sarah's voice rang out clearly as she reviewed each case. "Approved. Approved. Expedited approval needed. Critical care required." Around noon, Mike returned from his medical appointments, walking more smoothly, with properly managed pain medication, for the first time in years. He found Tommy helping distribute water bottles to the review team, while Sarah was deep in discussion with another nurse about a particularly complex case. His phone buzzed again. "Progress report?" Mike texted back. Sarah's reviewed 47 cases, all approved. New pain meds working. Tommy's becoming the unofficial mascot of the review team. The response: "Good, keep going. Bob's job depends on it." Sarah looked up as Mike approached her station. "You're walking better already," she noticed, smiling through her tears. "New meds. And they're scheduling surgery to repair the nerve damage they found." He gestured at her computer screen. "How's it going here?" "It's..." She wiped her eyes. "Mike, these stories. Every single one could have been us. The system's been failing so many families." "But not anymore." Tommy piped up from where he was organizing files. "Right, Mom?" Sarah pulled their son into a hug. "Right, baby. Not anymore." By the end of the first day, the review team had processed over 500 cases. Each approval meant a veteran would sleep better that night, a family would worry less, a child might get needed medication. As they were preparing to leave, an aide rushed in with a tablet. "President wants to FaceTime with the team." Everyone gathered around as Trump's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired, but satisfied. Bob tells me you've set a new record for cases reviewed and approved in a single day, he said. Mrs. Davis, I hear you're a natural at this. Sarah blushed. Just doing what needs to be done, sir. How's the inhaler working, Tommy? Tommy held it up proudly. Great! And Dad can walk better now, too. Trump nodded seriously. Good. Because this is just the beginning. Tomorrow we start on year 2 cases. I want every denied claim reviewed by the end of the month. No exceptions. As they drove home that evening, Tommy fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his inhaler. Mike reached for Sarah's hand across the console. You okay? It was an intense day. She squeezed his hand. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I'm really helping veterans, not just putting bandages on wounds the system caused. She paused. Do you think it'll last, the changes? Mike thought about all the families he'd seen that day, about the determination in the review team's eyes, about the pressure Trump was maintaining on the VA leadership. I think, he said slowly, sometimes it takes one story to change everything. One family brave enough to speak up. One leader willing to listen. He glanced at Tommy in the rearview mirror. One child's empty inhaler, to make people finally see the truth. Sarah wiped away tears. I have 30 more cases to review tomorrow. And I have physical therapy at 9. Mike smiled. Want to bet Tommy's going to charm his way into helping the review team again? He's going to grow up seeing how change really happens, Sarah said softly. Not through forms and procedures, but through people caring about other people. As they pulled into their driveway, Mike's phone buzzed one last time. Day 1 complete. Ready for day 2? Mike looked at his sleeping son, his dedicated wife, thought about his pain-free legs and typed back. Yes, sir. We're just getting started. The system hadn't been completely fixed in one day. There were still battles to fight, changes to make, veterans waiting for help. But for the first time in years, hope wasn't just a word. It was a promise being kept, one case at a time. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Davis family became a symbol of both what was wrong with the system and how it could be fixed. News crews came and went, each wanting to tell the story of the veteran who spoke up and the president who listened. Dad! Look! Tommy called out one morning, pointing at the television. CNN was showing footage from the rally again, focusing on the moment Sarah held up the empty inhaler. We're famous! Mike turned down the volume as political analysts debated the impact of what they were calling the Davis effect on veteran healthcare reform. Being famous isn't the point, buddy, he said, pulling Tommy close. What matters is helping other families like ours. The phone rang. It was Sarah calling from the VA center. She was still working full-time on the review committee, her nursing expertise proving invaluable in understanding complex medical claims. You won't believe this, she said, her voice excited. Remember that Vietnam vet from the pharmacy line? His appeal just got approved. Full benefits, backdated 20 years. He's crying, Mike. Says he can finally get the surgery he's been needing. Mike smiled, remembering the elderly veteran who'd approached them that first morning. How many cases approved so far? We just passed 10,000, Sarah replied. Bob says we're on track to review every denied claim from the past 2 years by the deadline. And, she paused dramatically, the president just approved funding for 10 more review centers across the country. They want me to help train the new teams. Tommy, listening on speakerphone, bounced excitedly. Mom's going to be a teacher! Something like that, baby. Sarah's voice softened. How was physical therapy this morning? Mike flexed his leg, still amazed at how much better it felt with proper treatment. Doc says I'm making excellent progress. Might even be able to try jogging soon. Jogging? Tommy's eyes went wide. Really? Really. But first, someone has a baseball game this afternoon, right? There was a moment of silence on the phone. They all remembered the last game, when Mike had collapsed from pain. You sure you're up for it? Sarah asked quietly. Got my meds, got my new prosthetic fitting, and got my son's first start as pitcher to watch. Mike ruffled Tommy's hair. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Later that afternoon, sitting in the bleachers at Tommy's baseball game, Mike reflected on how much had changed. His phone buzzed with a familiar number. Enjoying the game, Sergeant? Trump's voice came through clearly. Yes, sir. Tommy's about to take the mound. Good. Bob tells me we've passed 10,000 approved claims. Sarah just told me. She also mentioned the new review centers. Your wife's doing amazing work, Sergeant. We need more people like her in the system. There was a pause. How's the leg? Better than it's been in years, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank your family for having the courage to speak up. Another pause. You know, some people said I was crazy to stop a rally for one veteran's story. Said it was political suicide. To admit the system was broken. Mike watched as Tommy took his position on the pitcher's mound, standing tall and confident. And now, sir? Now they're calling it the biggest reform of veteran healthcare in decades. But you know what I call it? What's that, sir? A promise kept. Now go watch your son pitch. I hear he's got a mean fastball. Mike laughed. Getting better every day, sir. As he hung up, Mike caught Sarah's eye across the bleachers where she sat with her review team colleagues who'd come to support Tommy. She smiled, and in that smile was everything they'd fought for. The right to be a normal family again, to watch their son play baseball without fear, to help other families find their way back to normal too. Tommy looked up at the bleachers, found his parents, and waved. Mike waved back, his eyes misty. His son would grow up knowing that one person's courage could change the system, that one family's story could open doors for thousands of others, that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest things, like an empty inhaler and a father's love. As Tommy wound up for his first pitch, Mike Davis sat pain-free in the sunshine, watching his son play ball, knowing that across the country, thousands of other veteran families were getting their own second chances. Some stories end with big dramatic moments, but the best ones, the most important ones, end with simple things. A child's smile, a family's healing, and promises not just made, but kept. And that makes all the difference.